Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'll be giving you some top tips for building the best possible team you can in Game Week 1. Whether you are new to the game or you're a veteran of the game, this video should be helpful. If you are enjoying the content here on this channel, please do remember to like, comment and subscribe. But without further ado, let's jump into today's video. So guys, tip number one is something which we've actually discussed in a little bit of detail in recent streams and recent videos as well. And that is that in my personal opinion, price points are more important than players when going into Game Week 1 and building your Game Week 1 team, at least for the majority of your squad. Now, what we essentially mean by that is that the price that the player's actually coming in at, for example, Haaland is an £11.5 million forward. That, in my opinion, is more important than the fact that you are selecting Haaland. So the personnel, yes, it's important for a few players. You want the likes of Trent and Salah. But more importantly, I think you need to look at the price that they're coming in at. Because if you get someone at the correct price, what that allows you to do is it allows you to move to other players at a similar price without taking too many hits. So what I want you to think is this is not a free hit. You're not building this team just for one single week, and you're not building the team just to have that specific player. What you're doing is you're putting that player in because, number one, yes, they're a great option. They have good fixtures, but also you can easily get to other players at a similar price. So some of the key price points that I've identified early on, and the game's only been out for a few days, so potentially we'll update this. But there are three key price points in the different positions that I personally think it would be worth having at least one player in these price points. So I think the £6 million defenders look really, really valuable this season. So Chilwell, James, Laporte and Diaz, just to name four there. I think the £6 million defenders could be really good. And then even at 5.5, you've got Perisic, and then 5 you could downgrade to. So I think it would be really valuable when you're building your teams. You don't have to go huge at the back, but having two £6 million defenders will allow you to get two of those really good ones in, and then you can move to the others. If Perisic looks a great option, but you've gone for Chilwell and Diaz, it's very easy. If you've got, for example, Laporte and James, but Chilwell looks great, you just move on to the next person. So to the other player, I should say. So if you have two £6 million defenders, I think that will leave you fairly flexible. Similar for the 5.5/6 million midfielders. Now, at the moment, it looks a little bit bare in the 5.5 million midfielders. Everyone's got Neto. Potentially, some people have Martinelli at 6 million. But there are other good options in there. For example, Elise, Eze, they could be good options at some point. I think there are various 5.5 to 6 million midfielders that will arise. We saw the same with like Gallagher last year. So I think it's always good to have at least one sort of cheap midfield spot. Start with whoever you want. Start with Neto. Start with Martinelli. At least you can then switch to whoever is up and coming and starts to get those price rises early on. And then the one that, in my personal opinion, is the most important price point, I've been droning on about it in every single video, is the £8 million midfielders. There are 7 excellent £8 million midfielders this year. I think you have to have at least one in your squad. If you do have just the one, it means you can switch to whichever one you want. If you have two, what that allows you to do is always have the best one. For example, you can have Diaz for the entire season, and then the second one you can switch around the £8 million midfielders. So it's very critical, I think, at this stage when you're building your team that you're looking at these price points as much as the actual players. And if possible, just to drive this home, what I love to do is to include the most expensive player in each position. So I've currently got Trent, Salah and Haaland. By doing that, I can always get to whatever player I want to. Ideally, I wouldn't want to sell any of those 3 players, but by having the most expensive player, it's much easier to downgrade than it is to upgrade. So there's some tips there. And if I just switch over to sort of draft here, if you haven't already watched my draft video from yesterday, this is it. I've just basically done a color overlay on some of the players. But you can see here, when I'm building a team, and this is genuinely the way I think about it, I put in some of the essentials, and for me, the only 2 that I desperately want in every single draft, and they're going to be in there no matter what, for me, is Trent and Salah. They're too good value for me, and even if they were more expensive, the amount of points and consistency you get, for me, they're worth having. So I've put Trent and Salah in. Outside of that, I don't really mind. For me, I'm more interested in the price point. So as you can see, I think at the moment, I'm still going to go for a £4.5 million goalkeeper. You can see I've plugged in 2 spots here for £6 million defenders. As I said, I think that's a really good price point. And then a £5 million defender as well. The reason I've gone for a £5 million defender rather than a 4.5 is, again, it's easier to start with a 5 and then downgrade to a 4.5 than it is to do the other way, because then you have to make 2 transfers to fund it. I've got 2 £8 million midfielders. I've got a £6 million midfielder in there. I've then got a premium striker. This could be Kane. This could be Haaland. It could even be Ronaldo and Vardy if you want to go down a bit. And then I've got a mid-price forward in there at 7.5 million. Again, it's easier to go from 7.5 to like an Undav or a Brennan Johnson than it is to go the other way. So when you're building your teams, just to drive home the point once more, try and think about the prices of the players and what other players there are. So a good example here of someone like a Coutinho or a Grealish, I really do like them as players, right? I think they could be really good value this season. Harvey Barnes as well. There aren't that many around 7 million. You've then got maybe like Marcus Rashford at 6.5, who again might be a wait and see. Maybe a couple of options at 6. So if you start with a Coutinho, but the £8 million midfielders such as Foden, Mahrez, Kulusevski all start smashing it, you've got to suddenly find 1 million. Or you've got to downgrade all the way to a player that you might not potentially want. So hopefully that makes it clear. Let me know down below if this is something that you think about. I'm just trying to drive home the point that you want to be as flexible as possible going into Game Week 2, going into Game Week 3. You don't want to suddenly be scrambling to get a player in that's more expensive than the price point you've dedicated for that position. So guys, tip number 2 is one that might seem fairly obvious, but it's always worth reminding ourselves of, especially if you are new to FPL. And that is that you need to try and look at least 3 to 5 game weeks in advance. As I alluded to in the first section, this is not a free hit, i.e. you're not just building this team for Game Week 1. Even if you're planning an early wildcard and you're someone that likes to wildcard early, this team's still got to see you 3 to 5 weeks most likely. And yes, you do definitely have free transfers. You get a free transfer every week and you can use those. And you do have the wildcard in the back pocket in case something goes wrong. But I don't think you should build the team with that in mind. I don't think you should build the team ready to fail, build it very short term. I think you should ideally, in my opinion, I always say 4 to 6 weeks, but I think as a minimum 3 to 5 weeks is how far in advance you should be looking. And just to try and just drive home this point and give you an example, I've built here a team to prove my point, all right? So, yes, you probably wouldn't have triple Newcastle, although they do have some really great fixtures early on, and they looked brilliant in the back end of last season under Eddie Howe. But I've tried building a fairly realistic team. You've got Salah, you've got Haaland, you've got Trent and Cancelo, Raya, Trippier. This team is largely very, very close to the template at the moment. So this is the team that I've built. I just wanted to show you, looks absolutely excellent for Game Week 1, right? And if you skip to Game Week 2, still looks really good. There are no issues here. Again, Raya against Manchester United is not ideal, but your keeper's not going to have a perfect fixture every week. The other 10 players are absolutely fine. Like, you do not need to change this at all. So you would go into Game Week 3 with 2 free transfers. But of course, the reason I've built the team the way I have is to now say, what happens if you don't look ahead? What happens if you just build a team with 1 or 2 game weeks in mind and you attack those fixtures? You could find yourself in a place where you now arrive at Game Week 3 and you can see the team is a bit of a state. So even with a strong-ish bench, I've got Johnny on the bench. Johnny and Neto play against Spurs. Trippier, Bruno and Wilson play against Manchester City. I've got Sancho against Liverpool. Man United for Trent and Salah probably isn't the worst fixture in the world. We know they like to play against United. But you can see here, realistically, only maybe Raya, Cancelo, Haaland and maybe Saka. They're the only ones you'd really want to play every single week with those sort of fixtures. So you would be stuck here. You would be either having to play a very, very suboptimal team, or you would be having to take a massive hit. So you probably wouldn't ever go this far. It probably wouldn't ever be this bad. But there is absolutely no harm in either using a site such as FPL.team, where you can skip ahead and look, or just build your own spreadsheet. It only takes 5 minutes to just look ahead. And like I said, I would recommend probably 4 to 6 weeks. But even if you want to look a little bit shorter term and you're not that interested in planning that long term, maybe go for 3 weeks and just look ahead and keep doing that. You have to update it. So in Game Week 2, you start looking ahead to Game Week 4. Then 3, you look ahead to 5. Just so that you're a little bit ahead. And if you start to realize that, oh dear, like my team looks terrible for Game Week 7, you can start making transfers ready for that. And you're not caught out by surprise when that eventually happens. So this is something, like I said, for new managers, I think it's incredibly important. Even for veteran managers, even if you've been playing for years, when you first build your Game Week 1 team, you probably haven't thought long term. So the closer we get to Game Week 1, start to think about how your team's going to shape up, not only for Game Week 1, but for 2, 3, 4 and beyond as well. And I guarantee it will help you out early on in the season. So continuing the theme from tip 1 about being as flexible as possible, this is a question I've had a few times, and it's about leaving money in the bank with your original team. Now, there is no correct answer to this. Different people have different opinions on it. The way I would try and sum up my opinion on this is that 0.5 million in the bank can be useful. With so many engaged managers early on, but particularly between sort of Game Week 1 and Game Week 5, or at least in the first couple of weeks, if there's 10 million teams, most of those teams and managers will be active, right? No one's likely to give up after 1 week. They tend to start giving up around sort of Game Week 9, Game Week 10, as we approach the busy period over Christmas and there's multiple game weeks. So because there are so many millions of engaged managers early on, price changes are absolutely chaotic. So prices are just very, very volatile because so many managers are playing, so many transfers are happening, and so many people are reacting quickly to these transfers, to these performances. They might even transfer them out at the weekend. You can very, very easily get priced out of a move. So for example, say after the first Game Week 1 Saturday of football, loads of people transfer out Foden, and you've got Foden at £8 million. and loads of people transfer him out because he got injured or he had a really poor performance or he was benched. He goes down to 7.9. And the player that you want to bring in is Kulusevski, because Kulusevski scores a brace and he looks absolutely fantastic. By the end of that game week, Foden could be 7.9. Kulusevski could be like 8.1 or 8.2. All of a sudden, you've got that £8 million price point, as we spoke about in the first tip, but you can no longer afford Kulusevski because there's a £0.3 million difference between the two. That's the way that price falls and price rises work. So you can very easily get priced out of a move early on in the season. What 0.5 million in the bank therefore allows, it doesn't really allow upgrades early on, or it doesn't normally allow upgrades, but it allows you to account for those price rises and at least deal with them. So you're not rushed into making a transfer before you want to. What I would say, though, however, on this is that I don't think it's normally optimal to leave more than 0.5 in the bank. £100 million is a very, very tight budget early on. As you probably realise when you're building this, you never really build a draft that you're happy with and you've got like a few million left in the bank. The reason is players are relative. I mean, they've been underpriced this year, but they're still quite expensive. You don't have a massive budget to play with, and you want to try and make the most of that as possible. That being said, don't feel like you've got to spend it all. If you build a team you really do like and you've got £1 million in the bank, keep it. That's absolutely fine. But generally speaking, I think it's probably better to try and use as much as possible. That being said, I did see a draft last year, and it was absolutely fantastic. Someone left £5 million in the bank, and they only had one premium. And what that 5 million allowed them to do is after game week 2 or game week 3, they decided which second premium they wanted, or they decided if they wanted to spread the funds. It's definitely a creative way to approach the game. I don't mind that. But generally speaking, yes, 0.5 million in the bank. I guarantee you will find it useful in either game week 2 or game week 3. But 0.5 is a big amount early on. And if you feel like you could use that better to pick a better player in game week 1 that you truly do want in your team, I don't think it's essential that you leave 0.5 million in the bank, but let me know down below, what do you tend to do? I think in the last 3 seasons, one of the seasons I left 0.5 in the bank. The other 2 seasons, I spent the full 100 million. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts, though, and if you've got any tactics on how to build the most flexible team going into game week 1. I've called this tip number 4, but you've actually got about 3 tips in one here. But it's all around which players to select. And there's lots of questions always. And again, there is no right answer, and there's no right answer for anything in FPL. We're all just trying to guess and work out the best possible way to approach the game. But I do think there are a few things to note. And it's basically me just trying to keep you as sensible as possible and as logical as possible, whilst also reminding you that this is a game where we're meant to have fun. So if being too sensible and too logical doesn't make the game fun for you, then don't do it. That's absolutely fine. But there are a few things here which I think are important to note. The first thing is with the new 5 sub rule in particular, but this is always the case, nailed players are very valuable early on in the season. Whilst we're trying to sort of find our feet and work out which players we want, which structure we want, which players are going to be valuable for the upcoming season, nailed players are really, really good to have in your team early on. And that doesn't have to be every single player, but I would say in your starting 11, if you can try and have 8 or 9 players, which you don't even have to look at the team sheet, you know for a fact. Ward-Prowse is a good example. He's not very explosive, but you never would have to check that Ward-Prowse is in the starting 11. As many of those players as possible is really useful. So if we go back to the £8 million mids, which is a very, very sort of hot topic at the moment, as which of those 7 to pick, maybe someone like I don't know, like a Bowen at 8.5 might be worth the extra 0.5 just to have that nailed player. I've put Saka here. Saka and Mount are maybe slightly more nailed on than the likes of sort of Mahrez and maybe Kulusevski. We're going to have to wait and see, but maybe it's worth going for those that maybe their numbers aren't as good. Maybe their underlying data isn't as good, but they are slightly more nailed, at least early on and at least in a few of the positions. I just feel like you don't need the headache on top of trying to work out what's going on, eye test, underlying data, trying to work out what transfers to make early. I don't think you need the headache of having to check the lineup and then that player's benched. And then if they're benched in game week 1, does it mean they play in game week 2? I don't think you need that much of a headache with too many of those players. So that's just my personal opinion on it. I would try and limit to sort of unnailed players to maybe 1 or 2 there. You've got be careful with new arrivals and newly promoted players. Again, this isn't a rule for every single player. I look back to the likes of Salah in his first season in the Prem with Liverpool. Absolutely ridiculous season. I believe that was his 300-point plus season. You've also got Bruno Fernandes, came in at mid-season, absolutely smashed it. So I do believe the likes of Haaland will play very well. And I do believe that, for example, Mitrovic, Brennan Johnson, they could do very well. But again, I would try and limit picks from newly promoted teams and from players that are just arriving in the Premier League to 1 or 2 again. I don't think you need to go overkill where you've got loads of unnailed players, loads of newly promoted players, and then it just drives home the point once more with the third point. You don't need loads of players that are lowly owned. I don't think you should pay any attention to ownership in game week 1. It does not matter whether everyone owns the player you've got or no one. I think you should pick the players that you think will score the most points. And the majority of the time, they're going to be owned by a lot of managers. For example, Trent will probably be the top scoring defender this season. He's going to be owned by a lot of managers. That doesn't matter. If you think he's going to score the most points, get him in your team and keep him in your team. So I just think with all of this, try and build a team that you think will do well, irrespective. Imagine you're the only person playing the game, right? Imagine no one else exists and you are building the best possible team you can to get you the most possible points. Build that. And if you think, wow, this is super boring, like I don't enjoy looking at this team, then just take out a couple of the players and you can replace those players with slightly more differential picks, with a few newly promoted players, with a few players that are less nailed. I don't think you need to go overkill a bit. But let me know down below, do you try and go super aggressive, super risky early on? I personally think the back end of the season is the time where you can get a little bit more risky with it. For now, just build a team that you think is going to do well over the first few game weeks. It wouldn't be an FPL advice video if we didn't speak about captaincy. As I always say, in my opinion, the most critical decision every week, and it has the ability to completely derail your season or make your season captaincy. And whilst there is no magic formula to always selecting the correct captain, at the very least, what you can do is you can make a note of captaincy rotations well in advance. And what I mean by that is work out who you're going to captain every week for the next 5 to 6 weeks and make sure you own that player. And you can go even one step further than this and just make sure that you always own the best captaincy option every week. And that is very, very feasible to do. Some people won't believe it is, but it is very, very feasible. And I think those managers that put an emphasis on captaincy are likely the managers that will do the best. So if you think at some point over the first 6, Son is the best captain. Try and get him in for that fixture. If you think Salah is, try and get him in for that fixture as well. So what I've just noted down here, a very, very basic version. You can do this for a lot longer. You can do this with different players as well. Is the captaincy rotation for City and Liverpool, City and Spurs and Liverpool. And this is basically for Son / Kane, Haaland / KDB, and then Salah. Just to show you, if you're only to own 2 of these premiums, which are the best 2 premiums to own for captaincy rotation? So you can see here, the first one is Haaland and Salah, or at least Manchester City and Liverpool. Really, really nice rotation. Over the first 6, if you rotate Haaland and Salah, you get Fulham, Bournemouth, Newcastle, Bournemouth, Forest, Everton. So 3 are against newly promoted teams, and the other 2 are against Newcastle and Everton there. Alternatively, if you look at Haaland and Son, so this would, or Haaland and Kane, De Bruyne and Kane, whoever it is, Man City and Spurs, without Salah, you still get decent fixtures. I would argue that they're probably fairly similar here. So you get Bournemouth, Forest, Fulham, so you get 4 newly promoted teams, and you get Southampton and Wolves in there, both at home for Spurs. This does drive home the point that you could probably get away without Salah if you really wanted to, because the captaincy rotation is fine. And this is what it allows you to do. Plan in advance and think, I don't want Salah, he's 13 million. I can actually go without him, have Son, save $1 million, and use that $1 million elsewhere. So it does work. The one that I think is probably the worst rotation, but it still isn't bad, is if you rotate Son and Salah. So you can see Fulham, Palace, Wolves, Bournemouth, Newcastle, Fulham. Again, it's not a bad set of fixtures at all. You still play 3 newly promoted teams, Fulham twice. I just think that the other 2 rotations are ever so slightly better. But what this does show you is that you can get away with rotating 2 premiums at once. And just to give you sort of a secondary tip here, I do believe that you should have at least 2 premiums in your team at all times. The reason for that is that it just allows you to switch to other premiums. You might start the season with, for example, Kane and Salah, and then you realise, actually, I think Haaland's slightly better, or you start with Son and Salah, and you realise De Bruyne is absolutely on fire. Having 2 premiums allows you to switch to another premium very easily. If you just had Salah as an example, it might be you're like, yes, I want De Bruyne, yes, I want Son, but I don't want to sell Salah to get them, and then you're scrambling to try and get the funds away from certain players. So think about captaincy, plan it in advance, work out the rotation that you think is best for captaincy. And just as a secondary tip, in my opinion, the perfect sweet spot is not 1 premium, it's not 3 premiums, it's 2 premiums, and then rotating those, which were the ones you want for captaincy. So tip number 6 is around pre-season and using it to your advantage. Use pre-season to scout. Even if you're not watching the football, read articles, listen to podcasts, use it to its advantage because it can be an incredible tool. The reason that a lot of managers often, even though they're top managers, start the season slowly is we don't actually have any data. Yes, we have the data from last season. Yes, we have historical data. And yes, I suppose after game week 1, we've got 1 game week's worth of data. But that's too small of a sample size to draw trends from. And last season's data might not apply at all. For example, if a team's changed formation, they've got a new manager, they've signed a new player, it might be that all of the data from the player that you're looking at from last season just doesn't apply now. So what pre-season allows is it allows us to gather not necessarily data as such, but a little bit of an eye test, gives us some information about sort of tactics, formations, etc. And it can help us identify what I've put there. If you don't know this term, OOP is out of position players. Sometimes it will be, again, for example, that a player is listed as a defender and they line up on the wing. We've seen it in the past. Lord Lundstrom was the one for Sheffield United a couple of seasons ago now. Lined up, he was a defender and he played in midfield. So these can be the players that are really, really useful, and it allows us to get players that are absolute budget gems and bargains. So again, even if you're not watching the football yourself and you're not doing the scouting yourself, you can do secondary scouting. Use Twitter, watch my YouTube videos. I'll let you know if there's anything that I highlight in the preseason scouting that I'm doing, and it can be very, very useful. But as you can see, that last point there, also take it with a pinch of salt and use some context. For example, don't draw the conclusion that Martial's nailed if we don't know if Ronaldo's going to return, or if, for example, Rashford or Elanga picked up an injury, Martial's starting all of the games. Do take into account context. Take it with a small pinch of salt, because it might be that the manager's trying out different things. Just because he uses a formation once doesn't mean that's the formation that he'll play in the Premier League. So I suppose find that line between, yes, using it to your advantage, but also taking it with a slight pinch of salt and trying to put it into context of how that will carry over to the Premier League. Let me know down below if you're going to do any of your pre-season scouting, and if you want any videos around players that have done well in pre-season. I'm happy creating some of those videos for you. So guys, there you have it. That is my video around trying to build the best possible team you can for Game Week 1. There are 2 other videos which will help you in unison with this video. So the first one is my top 10 tips just for FPL in general. I released that a couple of weeks ago. You can find that on my channel. And secondly, the video that I released yesterday, which is my first official draft with the new FPL site. So you can watch both of those videos in combination with this one, and hopefully the 3 videos together will give you the best possible opportunity to build the best possible team for Game Week 1. If you are enjoying the content here on this channel, I really do appreciate you liking, commenting, and subscribing as well. We're trying to hit 20,000 subscribers, which is very optimistic before the start of the season. But if you are new to the channel and you haven't subscribed, please do consider doing so. Until next time, guys, thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.